we're looking at De Morgan's Collectors and Commissioners today, and I've got the title there, Potter to Peers, Princesses and Polite Society, which we'll find out as we go through. So the presentation will focus on who William de Morgan is and his patrons and commissions. So William was the son of Professor Augustus de Morgan, a professor of mathematics at University College London, the youngest ever person to take that position and the first ever professor of mathematics. He was only 21 when he took it on and continued throughout that position for the whole of his life. So William was born on Gower Street in London, right by the University College, and was educated at the University College schools. William's mother was Sophia Friend, obviously Sophia de Morgan once she got married, an incredible woman who campaigned tirelessly for lots of socialist issues she believed in, such as prison reforms. She campaigned for women's education. She was anti-vivisection and she was an abolitionist, so she believed in the abolition of slavery. So someone we can really look up to even today. William was encouraged from a young age to take up drawing, and here's a charming picture in the archives at Senate House at the University of London, where you can see in his mother's hand up at the top there, it says Willie drawing 1846, making him just 7 years old when he drew these wonderful soldiers. He developed quite quickly and soon got much better than that. And this is a drawing of William's from him being sort of late teens, age 16 to 17. And you can see there an inscription on the reverse of this drawing saying drawn at Carey's. Carey's was a drawing school that prepared young men to join the Royal Academy, some women as well, but not really during William's time. And they would learn to draw from the antique cast, as we can see he has done here in this beautiful pencil sketch, in order to pass their entrance exam to the Royal Academy, where they would continue to do that until they were permitted to begin their education in oil painting, which William did. And this is one of his oil paintings. So you can see here it's very much in the pre-Raphaelite style, these great luscious draperies with this Italianate landscape behind him. And here we have the alchemist's daughter, so the young woman there speaking to her father, the alchemist, and yeah, there she is with this sort of gorgeous little pot and the vases all around him. Oil painting didn't really interest William, however, and after meeting William Morris in 1863, he soon began making stained glass alongside the firm, and then in his own right, whilst he was living very close to T.L. Lyons, a stained glass designer, and that was in London. By 1872, De Morgan had begun to develop his own ceramic pottery business, which he did from 1872 until the business closed in 1904. And you can see here a selection of these wonderful plates. From left to right, they are there in order of development. So we have the sort of quite naive looking lustre on the left, and then in the middle a lustre glaze finish that uses a silver and copper oxide glaze in it. You can see the wonderful gold and ruby colours coming through there. And in the final design on the right hand side, this is one of his so-called moonlight suite of pottery, because it sort of shines in this wonderful crepuscular light with the gold and the copper and the silver, which he invented by mixing the glaze with a slip. So just brilliant mind, and it was from him sort of being this wonderful chemist, really, that he was able to produce this lustreware. His influences for his designs themselves came from a huge, wide-ranging variety of sources. So we can see here his animal designs, which I know lots of people really do adore in his artwork. He was also deeply influenced by Islamic and Islamic and Middle Eastern designs, sort of clubbed together in the Victorian period and known as Persian. And I will come on to that when we're talking about one of his commissions in particular. His tile making and pattern making, I think, is really what puts him at the very centre of the sort of arts and crafts movement, because when you look at sort of the wonder and the joy of his repeat designs, filled with these Islamic influences and the birds, and we look at some of his later pieces like this parrot panel, you can really start to see how all these elements build together to create something quite beautiful and quite wonderful. Most of De Morgan's work is held together today in the De Morgan collection. The De Morgan collection was founded by William's sister-in-law, his wife's sister, Wilhelmina Sterling, and there she is, probably in her 80s, I think, in this photograph, surrounded by her De Morgan plates and Evelyn De Morgan's wonderful pictures at her home in Battersea. So this, the collection was all put together by her, and she lived alongside it until she died at the age of 99, when it passed in trust to the De Morgan Foundation, which owns it today. It has a collection, the biggest collection in the world, of paintings by William's wife, Evelyn De Morgan. And today the collection is displayed at mainly these three locations: at Compton Hall in Barnsley, the Watts Gallery in Surrey, and at Whittock Manor in Wolverhampton, where we display our collection. We also have it in a number of loans, and one loan in particular, which is really what inspired me to put this talk together and to really become that little bit more interested and engaged in who William's patrons were, was our loan to the Queen's House at Greenwich. So the De Morgans were really interested in the sea and using the sea, seascapes, sea monsters, sea creatures in many of their designs. And you can see that here in Evelyn's wonderful painting of the Sea Maidens. Here we have the sisters of the Little Mermaid from the Hans Christian Andersen story, hand in hand, looking directly out at the canvas to us, and it's at a sort of a crucial point in the Little Mermaid story, where they go to beg the sea witch to sort of return their daughter, to allow their sister to avenge the rejection she's faced from the prince by giving him a dagger, and it sort of goes on in this horrible element until unfortunately the Little Mermaid kills herself. So it's quite an intense part in the story and picture by Evelyn, and it just shows how inventive both of the artists were in using the sea as a motif. And in the same room there, we have the display case with all of the wonderful De Morgan pottery. And the reason, like I said, that this talk came about in thinking about De Morgan's patrons is that someone else the Queen's House in Greenwich is partnering with in 2020 is Woburn Abbey. Woburn Abbey is the seat of the Duke of Bedford, up in Bedfordshire, and it's closed in 2020 for a major refurbishment. And as such, the Duke of Bedford wanted to lend a huge part of the collection to maintain that on public view during their closures. And the curator at Queen's House asked me if I would mind sharing our De Morgan cabinet with the Duke of Bedford's pottery. So of course I said, no, absolutely not. And when I went in to view the pieces and to see what they had, I was absolutely delighted to find the plate on the left there with the K Sarah Sarah banner around the outside and the goat motif in the middle, because this is a plate that had bothered me for years and years, since I saw the drawing for it at the V&A Museum and wondered what on earth it was about. Whilst William, as we know, is very interested in animals and depicting animals in his drawings, it's incredibly rare that he would use a motto in this way with, just for no reason. But I had no idea what the reason was. There was nothing in the V&A to link this plate to the Duke of Bedford. And so with this loan from Woburn Abbey, I was delighted to finally be able to see this plate and to know why it was made and what it was for. So a question is, where exactly is the plate? So the plate's currently on view at the Queen's House in Greenwich. I say currently with some hesitation because of course you will have to wait for the Queen's House to reopen, and you will find that information on their website when they're ready to do that in light of the coronavirus crisis. The drawing for the plate that's on the screen at the moment is in the collection of the V&A. So putting all of this together, I went back to the biography of William de Morgan, there, and his wife, by Mrs. Sterling, who we've met. And actually in her book here, you can see that in 1899, there was actually a commission for William de Morgan to complete a tile panel for the dairy frieze at Woburn Abbey. So when the Duke of Bedford was doing up his home there, de Morgan, right at the end of his career, really, in 1899, was commissioned to create this this panel. Here it is, a terrible picture, I'm afraid. I haven't been able to get up to Woburn Abbey for obvious reasons to take one myself. So this is one that they kindly shared with me. And you can see there, it's a wonderfully elaborate design, very similar to the parrots I showed you earlier, but sort of how the plates fit into this and why on earth de Morgan was being commissioned so late in life, really, to put this dairy frieze in was all a bit of a mystery. Seeing the plates in person led me to see that they were from much earlier. They were from 1888, and they'd actually been a wedding present commissioned by the Duke of Bedford. So there was already a link there by 1899. But what I've sort of gone on to find out, which has been quite an interesting link, is that there's sort of quite a deep family connection with the De Morgans and the Duke of Bedford, which I hadn't known until, again, sort of seeing this plate, which is brilliant. So this is Evelyn de Morgan's brother, William de Morgan's brother-in-law, and he's called Spencer Pickering, who's a preeminent scientist and a fellow of the Royal Society. Like his sister Evelyn, he'd enjoyed a private middle-class education. He went on to study at Oxford before becoming a teaching professor at Bedford College in Oxford in 1887. Very unfortunately, he lost an eye, or lost his eyesight, we're a bit unsure, in an experiment, in a scientific experiment in 1887, and resigned from his post. And you can see there that his picture's been taken in profile, and in fact all pictures of him are taken like this to protect, I think, his image of that lost eye. He didn't like hanging around and not doing anything, being a busy man with an active mind, being a scientist, and so he found some work as a farmhand. This was when the family had moved up to Harpenden in Hertfordshire, and he, through his inquiring scientific mind, became one of the leading authorities on something called allelopathy, which is the biochemical phenomenon where one organism produces one or more biochemicals that influence the germination and survival and reproduction of other organisms. So this idea that in biology, and especially in cultivating crops, it can be a good idea to sort of plant one thing next to another because they will increase its chances of success. So a very, very clever man. It didn't stop there. Through his experience, he decided it would be a good idea to establish an experimental farm so that he could undertake some scientific research on the growth of fruit trees. He didn't have enough money to do this himself, but here we go. He had been the schoolmate with Herbrand Arthur Russell, who had succeeded the 11th Duke of Bedford in 1893. So Bedford had inherited this vast estate at Woburn, not too far from Hertfordshire, where Spencer Pickering was living, and he just had inherited this huge income, but he had a strong interest in natural history and zoology, and was able to accept Spencer Pickering's proposal of the experimental fruit farm, and for the next 25 years that ran at Woburn, with Pickering living on the farm in the grounds of Bedford. So I just wonder whether, even though it's not evidenced, the reason de Morgan got this huge and important commission was A, that his work was already known to the Duke of Bedford through this wedding gift of the plates, but also it seems as though Spencer Pickering may have put a good word in for his brother-in-law and his failing business to allow him to have this large commission and an important commission sort of right at the end of his career, at the same time that he was struggling. And we know that De Morgan completed it half in Italy and half in the UK from his letters. Him and his wife, Evelyn De Morgan, based themselves sort of halfway between London and Florence, spending their winters in Florence very wisely from the 1890s. And so we know he lived between the two countries at that time. So a really difficult commission for him to take on, but I think very much supported by this family connection, and afforded him to probably be able to keep the business going a little bit longer and keep making the ceramics. So after I'd found out this really interesting link and been able to put all of this information about the wider De Morgan family together that we didn't know before, I wondered if other De Morgan commissions could teach us anything. One that we found out about recently is this absolutely wonderful reredo at Hornblotton Church in Somerset. For a long time, it was rumoured that these tiles were De Morgan, but because they're so atypical of his work, it required some further research. And huge thanks here to Richard Dennis, a De Morgan scholar and publisher, who lives quite close by to near Taunton, where Hornblotton is, and he was able to go to the Somerset archives and have a look at this for us. And what he found there is displayed on the left. It was a receipt in the archives for £12 to De Morgan for this commission from 1874, so only 2 years after he'd first begun his career as a ceramicist and moved over from stained glass. And I think that explains to us quite clearly the stylization of the tiles and the figurative approach he's taken. So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are the figures that are displayed, 2 on the left, 2 on the right of the central cross there. And it's very early designs that lean very heavily on his collaborations with William Morris, that honeysuckle design and the sort of maple-looking leaf definitely hark back to him working very closely with Morris. So this was a wonderful find, and it really showed us that De Morgan was being commissioned by a much wider range of clients than we thought he had been before. We didn't realise that any of the tiles had been made for ecclesiastical commissions. So this was a really exciting discovery. Not long after that, De Morgan had a commission from a friend. So whether this was done as a favour or any money exchanged hands, we're unclear. But you can see there this wonderful fire surround, which used to be in the dormitory room of Charles Dodgson, of course, who went on to be Lewis Carroll, whilst he was a student at Christ Church College in the University of Oxford. And you can see there these wonderful De Morgan illustrations of different De Morgan illustrations of different Lewis Carroll stories. And in particular there we have the hunting of the snark. So what the snark looks like, of course, the whole point of the story is that nobody knows. Well, we have this little eagle talking to this very odd sort of half bird, half tadpole, half snake typed creature, and it's thought that this was De Morgan's take on that idea of the snark. And it's just such a charming link between these two men who were very closely linked to mathematics. Mathematics is what Dodgson was studying at Oxford and knew William's father, Professor De Morgan, very well. But also William was friends with him, and this Victorian group of gents used to speak to each other in this sort of mock Cockney accent, and they were all very much into creating these fantasy worlds, and De Morgan was exactly in the centre of that as well. Another really successful commission that De Morgan won was through an architect called Richard Norman Shaw, and working closely with architects to create tiles to suit the houses that they were making worked particularly well for De Morgan. So here we have the Bedford Park Daisy, which is the blue flower with 3 heads that you can see at the bottom, and the Bedford Park Anemone, which is the 5 flower heads. And that will come in a range of different variations, either in the 4 square or the 9 square, which you can see examples of here. On the left is an illustration contemporary to these houses being designed and built, sort of a catalogue to show off Bedford Park, this purpose-built arts and crafts village which is in Chiswick. And I've recently been in touch with the Bedford Park Society to try and establish how many of these wonderful De Morgan tiles people are still lucky enough to have in their fireplace today. And it's not as many as I thought it would be, given that I think most of the houses probably had these De Morgan tiles in when they were new. So we know of five houses that still have the tiles in them, and the pub. So if you're desperate to see some De Morgan in situ, as soon as our pubs are back with us, which we all hope will be sooner rather than later, you'll be able to go off to Chiswick to the Tabard Inn in Bedford Park and see this wonderful frieze which dominates the building. It's on the exterior and interior, and it goes all the way across the top frieze of the building. Absolutely gorgeous colourway of the blue and yellow birds and the swirling grapevines there, so quite appropriate for a pub as well. It's a slight mystery as to whether these tiles were commissioned directly from Norman Shaw, as the specific Bedford Park designs were, or whether they were installed later by a landlord. The pub was built in 1880, but the design for the birds and the foliage are much later than that. They come from 1888, when De Morgan was working in Fulham. So there's still a little bit of research needed to be done there to see who the landlord was at that time and how this commission came about. So as with all good research, there's more questions than there are answers. Here we go. Here's Old Swan House in Chelsea, which is another Norman Shaw house. So probably off the success of his commission with the Bedford Park Daisy. You can see that in the fireplace here of this Norman Shaw house, we have the tile panel that's pictured in the middle, this wonderful Islamic sort of swirling design. This house was built in 1877 for William and Elizabeth Flowers. He was a lawyer and an art collector. Morris was employed by Flowers to create the whole interior scheme, and it seems like it would have been Morris that put De Morgan in touch in this case, rather than Norman Shaw. It's a little bit murky. We don't know which of the chaps it would have been, but you could always buy De Morgan tiles through Morris & Co. So, you know, they just match so clearly and well to the interior schemes of wallpaper and chintz fabrics that Morris was creating. And the De Morgan and Morris were such good friends that rather than produce his own tiles in earnest, he would sell De Morgan tiles for these interior schemes. Another wonderful building that has the De Morgan tiles within it here, we have a panel from the boudoir, no less, of 49 Prince's Gate, as it was then, where lived Thomas Eustace Smith, who was a Tyneside shipbuilder and a Liberal MP and art collector. They lived just next door to the Prince's Gate house that had the Whistler Peacock Room, so right in the heart of aesthetic movement London. These great opulent interiors. If you think sort of the work of Aubrey Beardsley and Oscar Wilde, very much at the centre of that is where we can place the people who were commissioning these houses, and De Morgan tiles of course just fit right into the heart of that. You can see that these designs are fairly naive. They're again from that earlier period when De Morgan was working in Chelsea, and probably from about 1874 for the boudoir of Thomas Eustace Smith. The architect in this case was someone called George Aitchison, who we will come back to. So probably again another commission from the architect rather than the owner of the house in this particular building. BBB was De Morgan's most successful commission. He developed it sort of out of the aesthetic movement really in the 1870s, and the reason it's called BBB, quite intriguing, is because it was commissioned by Barnard Bishop and Barnards, who were a Norfolk stove making company. They'd been around for a long time by the time De Morgan was commissioned. I think they were established in at the turn of the 18th century, so from in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and they wanted an attractive aesthetic movement tile that they could sell with their cast iron stoves, and De Morgan came up with the beautiful flowing curves of the BBB design for that. He started making it in the 1870s, and you can see here on the drawing on the left hand side, again these are in the archive of the V&A Museum, we have their 10th of November 98. So it's a design that De Morgan and Co produced throughout De Morgan's career, so you could buy that from the earliest till the very latest point in De Morgan's career, or I beg your pardon. He made literally thousands of these, and in the 1885 stock list of De Morgan & Co, it shows that there are 15,000 tiles held in stock waiting to be sold, and of those 2,000 the BBB design, 629 were the ruby luster, and 524 were the yellow BBB. So you can see just how popular that design was in order for them to reveal, for them to be selling so many of them throughout the lifetime of De Morgan & Co. So William Morris, we have to mention. As I said, De Morgan sort of first really fell into becoming a craftsman rather than an artist after meeting Morris in 1863. This is a Morris design for wallpaper. It's one of his earliest, the Rose and Trellis design from 1862. One of De Morgan's earliest designs is made exactly to complement this and to fit in with the same interior scheme, and that's from Chelsea, probably around 1872. And like I said, you could always buy De Morgan tiles through Morris & Co. The two gentlemen worked very, very closely together, and it's from the middle of the 1880s, so 1882 to 1888, Morris and Morgan both had premises at Merton Abbey near Wimbledon, where the tiles and the ceramics were produced alongside the wallpapers. This is a picture of Compton House in Wolverhampton. And Compton Hall was the last commission Morris ever completed in 1895, just before he died in 1896. It was a tough business decision, I think, to take it on, but we're so pleased he did, because being up in the sort of green area around Wolverhampton inspired him to create the wallpaper that's the background of this slide, which is called Compton, and it's the last design Morris ever made. And of course, he fills the house with De Morgan tiles to complement the work he'd done on the interior there. And you can just about see in the picture with the people at the bottom that the fireplace is there. It still exists, but today Compton Hall is a care home, so it's been quite difficult to obtain photographs of that, particularly at the moment for obvious reasons. So here we go, it's a sales catalogue for De Morgan & Co, and you can see quite clearly on there the Mongolian tile that we've just seen on the previous slide, for sale through Morris & Co. You can also see the Bedford Park designs. And the double carnation, very similar to the BBB, all for sale. Oh, there's the BBB down at the bottom right. So yes, we know that these two gentlemen were working together, and it seems as though Morris, much more successful in business than De Morgan, would often give his friend the commissions. People listening to this talk, I know quite a lot of you today, and I'm sure people are aware of Leighton House, but if you're not, that's definitely one to get on the list to visit. So Leighton House in Kensington was the studio home of Lord Frederick Leighton, who was eventually the president of the Royal Academy. De Morgan was commissioned probably, well, we don't know who exactly commissioned De Morgan to undertake the work of putting together and installing Leighton's original collection of Damascus tiles into his new Arab Hall extension. But the architect for this Arab Hall extension was George Aitchison, so we remember his name from the Prince's Gate Commission. So either Aitchison, the architect, or Leighton, the owner of the tiles, who both would have known De Morgan and De Morgan's work, by 1877, when the Arab Hall was installed, one of them commissioned him, and the the effect of it is just overwhelming, really. It's a complete ornate, indulgent and opulent interior. The tiles, like I've said, around the bottom are original, mainly Damascus tiles, but these were collected by Leighton, partly through his associate, but mainly by himself on his own travels as well, and they were installed by De Morgan. De Morgan also created all of the plain turquoise tiles, and where there were gaps in the scheme, so obviously, Leighton had just collected these tiles without any idea of the space they were going to be fitted into, and De Morgan had to put them all together like an impossible jigsaw puzzle, really. But where there were gaps, De Morgan would recreate his own tiles to fill those gaps. And I think this just shows how astute he was, even from at the earlier stage in his career. He'd only been working on the ceramics for around 4 or 5 years when he got the Leighton House Commission. You can see here what he's done is made copies of the designs in the original tiles, worked out his own pattern making around that, and then reproduced that design. So whilst the ones in Leighton House original, the De Morgan Foundation has tiles which are made by De Morgan exactly the same. So he's experimenting with the different colorways and making his own drawings after the original tiles to try and get the commission exactly right. So it really shows what an intrigued designer he was, always really pushing to develop himself and to create new designs and to find new methods of working. Perhaps De Morgan's most successful commissions really were for ocean liners. This began in 1880 with a commission from the Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who built his yacht, the Royal Steam Yacht Levadia, and De Morgan was employed to create tile schemes for the interior, particularly of the Crimean Tartar saloon. His designs were opulent and Middle Eastern in colour, so we think it's probably from the Leighton House Commission that he was awarded this one. There exists 3 jars made by De Morgan, all as elaborate and ornate as this one. This one's on display at the Queen's House in Greenwich as well. And you can see these wonderful grotesques, and it's such a tactile object. It's wonderful 3-dimension, which was very unusual for De Morgan. But these are called the Levadia Jars and were possibly made as part of that commission as well. There are another 2 in a private collection that are particularly similar, but this one belongs to the De Morgan Foundation. Lord Ashburton was soon to follow where the Tsar of Russia had led the way, and who wouldn't be? What a thing to do! If De Morgan's doing the Tsar of Russia's boat, anyone who's anyone is going to want one. And Lord Ashburton, you can see his name's written on the drawing here in the V&A. Commissioned De Morgan on the back of the Levadia Commission to design an interior for his ship. He was part of the Barings family, Barings Bank, so money really wasn't an option. And in 1886, De Morgan created these interior schemes for his yacht. So you can see they're very playful and very colourful. So whilst the colour palette itself is still leaning on this sort of Damascus idea, these cool blues and turquoises, the designs have got a little bit more inventive, and we have the wonderful playful fish motifs, ship images, and the wonderful owl as well at the bottom for this sort of area over the top of the fireplace. This is a small panel, probably made as a test or a sample, which is in the De Morgan Foundation's collection. So this was one that built up that larger scheme around the fireplace on the yacht. Soon after these 2 independent commissions by individuals, De Morgan was engaged by P&O Cruise Liners, so the company that still exists today, the Peninsular and Orient Steamship Company. So if you go on a fancy cruise today, that might be who you holiday with. And they commissioned De Morgan to create interior tile schemes for no less than 12 of their ships. So it was a huge commission for De Morgan and Co, and basically kept them afloat, pardon the pun, that was unintentional, through the 1880s. So from 1882, De Morgan was commissioned to make these beautiful interiors. At the top right there, you can see the design for SS Arabia, and if you look very closely at the black and white photograph, you'll see that repeating around the top, and that's above some of these very stylized, very Islamic looking De Morgan trees. So lots of motifs in this design that come from that, and the whole idea of these ship designs that De Morgan created for P&O were to evoke feelings in the passengers of the exotic locations that they might be travelling to. So all very much done for this upper class audience. So here we go, sort of sailing off on one of De Morgan's imaginary ships into that sunset as you sort of board this enormous cruise liner, the most expensive and luxurious passenger travel method of that period. And you can just see how fantastic these are in colour. This is a detail of a panel that's in the De Morgan collection. And again, a panel in the South London Gallery's collection, part of the Cart collection, that shows off these mosques and minarets. So again, we imagine where we might be able to sort of be taken away on these steamships. This drawing for a towel panel poses a little bit of mystery in that we can't be sure whether it was ever commissioned or not. The inscription that you probably can't quite read on the slide in pencil at the bottom of the drawing shows that it was designed for the dairy at Westwood House in Sydenham. This was a house that was redeveloped from an early 1790 building in 1880 by the ecclesiastical architect John Loughborough Pearson, who's responsible for things like Cornwall Cathedral. Pearson created this house, or was commissioned to create this house, by someone called Henry Littleton, who had made his fortune from novellas, who was a music publisher. And he built Westwood House around that area so that he'd be near to Crystal Palace, and that's sort of from the musical stars of Crystal Palace is where he'd really made his fortune there. In 1890, the socialist Edward Passmore had opened the building to be an orphanage. It then passed on to be a teachers' union and was sadly demolished in 1952. So because it ceased to be a private residency sort of so early in its creation in the late Victorian period, or from that Loughborough Pearson commission, so that was in 1880, and by 1890 it had been turned into an orphanage, so we're not sure if the tiles even survived that original transition. And then very sadly it was demolished in 1952, and research has sort of drawn up blanks at the moment as to whether we can find any photographs of the interior of that building. Even if we can, whether the dairy was photographed, it seems unlikely, but if anybody knows, then that would be great to let me know. But at the moment we just have this drawing, and it's such a charming drawing and quite atypical for De Morgan. So I think probably it was Henry Littleton that was the commissioner here, even though I can't be certain about that. And it seems that maybe it was done to his taste, because we have some quite chunky looking cherubs who are churning butter there on the left hand side, this lovely cow and some swans on the right hand side, and it's just quite a charming piece. And with the beautiful pinks in with the blues and greens, that is what makes it quite an unusual piece. It would be wonderful if it ever was commissioned. I'm just not sure whether it was. So this is a painting by Francis Colthurst, who trained at the Royal Academy. He was the son of a Somerset timber merchant who rejected the family business to go off to London and become an artist. He was keenly interested in the Middle East and travelled widely, becoming a successful painter of landscape and also of portraiture. You see one of these beautiful landscapes here with these Middle Eastern buildings in the background. He was also an avid collector of De Morgan pottery, and we know from seeing the original plates, which are held in Taunton, which was where he was from. They're now in the Taunton Archaeological Society's collection. You can see on the reverse of the plate there, they've got these shop stickers on from Morris & Co, showing that Colthurst bought most of his plates from Morris & Co, and there are some absolutely fabulous designs in this quite vast collection. So even though though Colthurst wasn't commissioning De Morgan, he was a contemporary collector of more off-the-peg pieces, so probably going to London, visiting the showrooms of De Morgan and Morris, and then buying these pieces directly from Morris & Co. And there he is. These charming illustrations were created when someone, and we don't know who, was putting a catalogue together for Augustus Pitt Rivers. So Pitt Rivers was one of the richest men in Victorian England and was an avid collector of ethnography. You might recognise the name from the museum in Oxford, Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford of Natural History, I beg your pardon. This Pitt Rivers was one of De Morgan's probably most notable contemporary collectors. So someone who was following De Morgan's career. He started buying the pottery in Chelsea and continued to buy it through De Morgan's career until he was working in Fulham and up into the 1900s. He purchased at least 25 pictures, and we know that pieces, and we know that from these catalogues, which are now in the University of Cambridge Library. So you can see he owned a wide range of different ceramics, beautiful red lustre bottles, plain gold lustre vases and jugs, and some of the rice dishes as well, which are the blue dishes on the right hand side slide there. Unfortunately, these pieces are no longer in the family's private collection. They were all sold off after Pitt Rivers' death, and we haven't been able to trace any of them. So yet more mysteries, because hopefully they're still out there somewhere. And like I said, we only know them from these very, very good illustrations in this wonderful catalogue. So if it were a public building, this would be without a shadow of a doubt the best place to see De Morgan. De Morgan went into partnership in the late 19th century with someone called Halsey Ricardo, who was an architect. The two gentlemen were very good friends as well as business partners. And through being an architect, Ricardo was working on his own commissions as well. And in 1904, a commission came to him from Ernest Debenham of the department store fame, and Debenham sort of agreed. He was quite an elaborate man, I think. He agreed with Ricardo that Ricardo could use up quite a lot of excess De Morgan stock in order to create this brilliant interior at his home, which is in London. It's still there. It's still in private ownership, which is why some of these pictures aren't brilliant, but there you get a bit of a flavour of what it's like at this wonderful building. You notice there the outside of the house is also tiled. They're not De Morgan, but the whole thing really is a shrine to this wonderful building. So one of the most exciting finds in this research has been the discovery of Winneretta singer, Princess Edmond de Pauliac, and there she is, that's a self-portrait. She was one of 24 children, either illegitimate or legitimate, of Isaac Singer, who was one of the richest men in the world, having inherited the Singer sewing machine empire. She was born in America but grew up in Europe, moving to Paris between the American and Franco-Prussian wars. Her second husband was Prince Edmond Melchior Jean-Marie de Pauliac, one of the most notable families of French aristocracy. She gained wide notoriety in her own life for her lesbian affairs and for her own artwork, which was very well received by the public. So there she is. And like I said, sort of one of the most interesting finds that I've come across really is she was a great socialist and a real giver, very, very generous, and a huge philanthropist in France. And she set up the Fondation Singer-Polignac to hold concerts, musical concerts, and most of her giving was aimed towards social housing projects in Paris. She also worked with Marie Curie in 1911 to provide suitable buildings for radiology, but also she wanted to further music and the arts and literature and science, and that's why this building was put together in Paris. An introductory video that was stumbled across quite by chance on the Fondation's website shows someone giving a tour of the swimming pool downstairs, and in the pool there are what are unmistakably De Morgan tiles all around the edge of the indoor swimming pool. So it's quite intriguing as to how they got there, how they ended up in Paris. Given the time of the building, it's likely that, just like with Debenham House, these were bought as stock to be installed in the scheme that they are. But it's wonderful that we can see this sort of wider reaching effect of De Morgan and his aesthetic tiles. And yeah, it sort of gives me hope that we might find more out there one day. De Morgan's very last commission felt like a good place to wrap things up. This is Postman's Park, which is in the City of London. It's a memorial to heroic self-sacrifice, and it was the brainchild of the eminent Victorian painter G.F. Watts, George Frederick Watts, who was a good friend of William De Morgan and his wife Evelyn. The De Morgans would visit the Wattses regularly, and particularly Evelyn De Morgan and George Watts shared the same ideas about their painting, and really sort of had the same interests in painting the same subjects. But Watts, for a long time, had envisaged that, why are all the memorials in London to the good and the great and to kings, and what happens to the people who are ordinary people who sort of deserve recognition? And he tried to get some backing and some funding for this idea, and nobody would give him any. And eventually he paid for it himself when the bishop of the churchyard, the memorial that Postman's Park used to be, said, okay, you can have this bit of land. And so this sort of very sad looking lean-to was eventually commissioned in the same year that Watts died. So Mary Watts, his wife, approached William De Morgan and said she wanted to create these beautiful ceramic plaques that would decorate the monument, and each of them would list the name of the person it was in memorial of and what happened to them. And they're all very, very sad, sort of heartwarming tales of people giving up their own lives in order to save others. But from a social history perspective, it's quite interesting to see in the terrible accidents that were going on in the Victorian period, because we can see there that Robert Wright of Croydon has unfortunately died in this terrible fire when there's petrol stored in the cellar. Fires, people being run over by cart horses, and people drowning seem to be the three most common deaths that people were suffering during this period. So, like I say, from a social history point of view, it's an interesting place to visit as well. So there we go. I sort of, like I said, that's a nice place to wrap it up with De Morgan's final commission. That came to him just before the potteries shut down, and he sort of ended his involvement with them in 1904.